there U.S. forces on the ground in Afghanistan?
If we had, how to phrase this so that it's perfectly clear again, we have not I mean, yeah, I mean, we've got, I'm disinclined to talk about things that are in process, and if we had significant numbers of U.S. military on the ground, it would have been known by now.
Do you plan to
send, Mr. Secretary,
the airdrops? Is that predicated on some level of confidence that you've taken out at least some of that air defense threat?
We certainly would not be using airdrops in portions of the country where we were not satisfied that it would be safe for humanitarian relief.
Mr. Secretary,
so we don't discuss operational activities.
Mr. Secretary, do you have any, can you tell us if there are any plans to send significant numbers?
I answered the question before you asked it. We do, we do not discuss operations.
Very much of the country is at least controlled now by the Taliban. Does that mean that, and most of the refugees actually are internally displaced people are in those sections of the country. Does that mean that those areas will not get the relief as quickly, that other non-Taliban held areas will get it more quickly?
Well, certainly, non-Taliban areas would get it more quickly.
Mr. Secretary, can we define a little bit about the humanitarian airdrops? Are these going to be, for the most part, high-altitude airdrops? You're going to use pallets and parachutes, or just kick them out the way we did over Kosovo and Bosnia?
It's more like the latter, but greatly improved. We know the effectiveness of those airdrops was less than desired. So between now and then, they have been working with the delivery means to improve that. We think we can be fairly effective from high altitude, and we're targeting remote locations where it's difficult to get trucks in. This has all been coordinated fairly well, very well, with USAID.
Just a follow-up. You're not just kicking out the rations, though, by themselves. They're coming down by a parachute or some means to the ground, or are they?
No, the delivery mode is pretty much like you described, a little more sophisticated than that, but it's not by parachute.
Or C-17?
Yes.
Is there a danger posed to the people on the ground that you're trying to help as the humanitarian aid comes in? Are you exposing them to fire, or are these two operations wholly separate?
There's no risk to the people on the ground that would have an interest in receiving the humanitarian drops.
Mr. Secretary, were C-17s used to drop the humanitarian daily rations today, and if so, how many?
There were 2 C-17s planned today to drop humanitarian rations.
That was 100% of what was carrying the HDRs?
For the first day, that's correct.
How can you drop them from high altitude? How can you drop them from high altitude? I mean, it's a layperson's question without using parachutes and not destroy them. I mean,
well, the system has been designed to do just that, and like I said, they've been testing ever since Allied Force stopped. Shortly after that, we began testing to make sure we could accurately deliver these, and that's been ongoing. We'll be able to put them where we want to put them.
well cushioned so that they correct.
General, don't they have precision radars that can map an area, kind of drop it within a certain bullseye?
Well, let me just go back. We have high confidence they'll be able to drop where their intended Afghan citizens are, and there are several ways to do that. Absolutely.
As part of the effort today, are you dropping leaflets? Have you begun radio broadcasts from Commando Solo and some of the other assets that you have that can do directed messages to the people who may not understand what you're doing?
Yes.
Yesterday, both of those?
Yes.
Mr.
Secretary, you said... Are you asking, sir, the non-Talibans to form a government, or are you waiting for the total defeat of Taliban?
That really is the business of the Department of State. And what we are doing is we are attempting to help those and advantage those that oppose Taliban and that oppose Al-Qaeda in that country in a variety of different ways. And how that might evolve and what that might mean from the standpoint of the future of Afghanistan, it seems to me is a good distance off, and it is not an issue that this department really is involved in.
Mr. Secretary, even
Are additional steps being taken to strengthen security in the United States in anticipation of some possible retaliation for this attack?
Well, most of the kinds of attacks that we've seen tend to have been planned months and months and months, in some cases years in advance. So the idea that any attack that could occur now would conceivably characterize as in retaliation for something, I think would be a misunderstanding of the situation. The United States is, as President Bush has indicated, is on a state of heightened awareness. And the armed forces around the world are on a state of higher alert than is normal. The forces in the United States are on a higher alert than has been the normal pattern for our forces. And the various organizations that deal with law enforcement in the United States, the FBI and state and local officials, are certainly aware that as of September 11th, we have to be sensitive to the possibility that there can be various types of terrorist attacks in our country. And as a result, the President has marshaled a great many of the capabilities of the United States government, including the military, to assist in seeing that we do what is possible. But the only way to deal with these terrorist threats is to go at them where they exist. You cannot defend at every place, at every time, against every conceivable, imaginable, even unimaginable terrorist attack. And the only way to deal with it is to take the battle to where they are and to root them out and to starve them out by seeing that those countries and those organizations and those non-governmental organizations and those individuals that are supporting and hiring, harboring and facilitating these networks stop doing it and find that there's a penalty for doing it. So we'll make this the last question, right in the middle. Yes, sir.
Apparently there were strikes in Kandahar and Kabul, and there's some talk about the electricity system going down. Are you running the risk of being characterized as attacking the Afghan people rather than the military targets?
You know, in this world of ours, if you get up in the morning, you're running a risk of having someone lie and someone mischaracterize what it is you're doing. What the United States of America is doing is exactly what I said. It is attempting to defend the United States by taking this battle to the terrorists that have killed thousands of Americans, that threaten not just the United States, but regimes throughout the world, because they are determined to find ways to intimidate the rest of the world and to terrorize the rest of the world. And we are determined not to be terrorized. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you tomorrow, Mr. Secretary.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in a wide-ranging news conference with General Richard Meyer, who's the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at his side, talking about the strikes that will continue. 50 cruise missiles were launched from both the United States and British forces that are in that region. He refused to say whether there were special forces on the ground in Afghanistan already. He did say, however, that if they were there in large numbers, we would know that. The Secretary repeatedly pointing out that no silver bullet will win this war against terrorism. The only way to do it is to make sure that those people are completely wiped out. He repeated as well, however, what President Bush has said again and again. This is not a war against Islam. It's not a war against Afghanistan itself. It is a war against Osama bin Laden and the Taliban rulers there. We're told now by the Taliban spokesman in Pakistan that, in fact, the Mullah Omar, who runs the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden both survived these initial attacks. We have no way of knowing whether, in fact, that is true. We did see a videotape message from Osama bin Laden, who said earlier that the United States was attacked in the softest parts, that there is fear east and west, north and south. Thanks be to God for that, as he put it. And he placed the blame squarely on the United States relationship with Israel, as well as the war against Iraq, when no Islamic leaders came to the defense of all those Iraqi soldiers who died, which does raise the possibility that Iraq has a piece of this action as well. There are emergency supplies that are being dropped at this hour. In fact, about 45 minutes ago, according to the Secretary, that operation was underway. C-17s flying at nighttime now over Afghanistan and dropping emergency food and medical and other supplies to the people there as the United States attempts not to have the fuse lit by Osama bin Laden among the other members of the Islamic faith who may be wondering which side they're on and what the United States thinks of them. So this is the latest. U.S. and British forces did attack Afghanistan using 50 cruise missiles, ships and aircraft. Most of the targets were command and control around the northern cities of Kabul, some in Kandahar in the south as well. The attacks could continue for as long as 5 hours today. To bin Laden in Al Jazeera television said there will be no peace for the United States as long as the Israelis continue to occupy what he described as the Palestinian territories. We want to get a military assessment of all this now with a number of crack military officers who are part of the NBC News team. Let's begin with retired General Robert Disney, who was a member of the Special Armed Forces and Operations Group during Vietnam and then was a military attaché in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan. What are the chances that these emergency food supplies that are being dropped tonight are going to get to the right people, General?
It's very difficult for me to speculate on that, Tom, but I would think that with our capability of pinpoint drops and knowing where the major groups of refugees are, that I think that the majority of the food drops will get to the people that they are intended for.
And what do we know about their command and control facilities and the sophistication of them that were the targets tonight? How hard should they be to take out?
Well, as Secretary Rumsfeld indicated, that they don't have an Army, an Air Force, and a Navy, and the equipment that they have is certainly not modern in terms of our estimation of modern. So my guess is that they'd be fairly easy to take out. They don't have that many of them to begin with.
What worries you about future military actions in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is the loss of American lives. That's certainly my concern. The terrain in Afghanistan is foreboding. It's some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world. And this is not going to be an easy campaign. It's going to be a very difficult campaign. As I mentioned earlier today on another program, a 19th century British journalist described the terrain in Afghanistan as a lacerated landscape. And that's really what it is. It's very, very difficult to operate in. Now with winter rapidly approaching, the opportunity to conduct operations rather easily in the mountains is going to be that much more difficult.
General Disney, thanks very much for being with us today. Someone who knows that territory very well. Let's go to General Barry McCaffrey now, who had an active role in Operation Desert Storm. What struck you about the briefing that we got from the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs and from the Defense Secretary General?
Well, it's certainly come across very clearly that the President's team has enormous experience and skill. I mean, Secretary Rumsfeld, General Dick Meyer, very experienced combat pilot, the Vice Chairman Pete Pace, four-star Marine. The people that he's got organizing this have a tremendous amount of talent and dedication to the task at hand. Let me, if I can, though, Tom, offer a viewpoint. It's a long way up there to Afghanistan. The logistics, the time-distance factors are unbelievable. Having said that, it would be my own estimation that in the coming 21 days, U.S. and Brit air and naval power will strip these people naked. Then they'll be hunted relentlessly from the air and ground throughout the winter. This is going to be a long, cold winter for the Taliban and the al-Qaeda terrorist network.
And special operation forces that go in there, we talked about this earlier today, do they set up a base and try to operate from that base, or do they have to stay on the move as well?
Well, I think the tactics of all this, I wouldn't want to be an armchair general. I've been a real general too long. I think what you will see, though, is that our ability to operate from the skies, whether it's with AC-130s or B-2 bombers or to land people by helicopter with pretty significant firepower, is enormous. These people are going to be dealing with some very dangerous ground and air elements in the coming weeks.
All right, thank you very much, General Barry McCaffrey. Let's go to Claudia Kennedy now, a retired three-star general, the first woman to achieve that status, Deputy Chief of Staff for Army Intelligence. How effectively can we use the so-called Northern Alliance as surrogates in that part of Afghanistan, General?
I think we can use them very effectively, Tom. You know, the important thing about the Northern Alliance to remember is that they have a checkered past, and they have had defections as the Taliban have become more powerful. Now, after the last 2 or 3 weeks, and especially after today, we're going to see a real shift in power from the Taliban to the Northern Alliance, as those groups who are marginal in their support of the Taliban, and were really only part of that because they were intimidated by them, will see that it's in their best interest to join with the Northern Alliance.
All right, Claudia Kennedy, thanks very much. William Arkin's in Washington. He's now become a very familiar face, of course, during times of American military action as one of our consultants. Mr. Arkin, what about the Northern Alliance? An effective fighting force?
Well, I think, Tom, that we saw an extraordinary briefing from Secretary Rumsfeld. He didn't hide behind operational security. He told us very clearly what was unfolding today. But we have to understand that the scale of the attacks, 25 fighters, 15 bombers, 50 cruise missiles, is suitable for the target. Afghanistan is not Iraq. It's not capital intensive. There aren't a lot of military forces to go after. There aren't a lot of bases. So while we did what we did today, as Secretary Rumsfeld said, we're paving the way for a much longer campaign. That campaign is going to unfold over the next few days and weeks. But what I think is important, and I think should be sobering for most people, is that these are all Afghans. And now that we've hit Afghanistan installations and training camps, the terrorist networks, the Taliban and the Taliban sympathetic are going to scatter. They're going to scatter into the population. And I think that we have to be careful while we undertake this precision war, while we undertake this information war, while we undertake this fancy new war, that we also at the same time don't run the risk of having purges and having death and slaughter on the ground in Afghanistan in order to achieve our goal. If the Northern Alliance is going to be our friend and going to be our ally in this war on terrorism, we have to get them to focus on terrorism as well and not on settling old scores.
Well put, Mr. Arkin. Now let me ask you, if I may, whether you saw the statement that was carried by Al Jazeera television from Osama bin Laden earlier.
You know, I did see that statement, Tom, and I have to tell you that as much as it might sound demented to most Americans, this is the view of very many Islamic youth on the streets in the Middle East, not just in places like Iraq, but in other countries as well. And I think that we need to really pause for a moment and understand that there's going to be a lot of people around the world, from Indonesia to Malaysia to Islamic countries in the Middle East, who are going to see the United States as the problem in the world. Now that we've taken military action, we may have better security in the United States, and there may be better security in Western Europe. But I think it's likely that we're going to see real fervent in the streets of the Arab world, real fervent in the Islamic world. We've now retaliated for the attack at the World Trade Center, but now this is just step 2, I'm afraid, in an opening war.
All right, thank you very much, William Arkin. Michael Short is a retired U.S. Air Force general. We heard that some of the planes had to go all the way from the United States and back. You wouldn't want to have a sustained air operation with those kinds of logistics for a long time, would you, General?
Well, Tom, as you'll remember, we flew B-2s from Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, to the airspace over Kosovo and Serbia and back again, about a 33-hour round trip in Allied force in 1999. My speculation would be that we have flown them out of Whiteman Air Force Base again, but we'll recover them in Diego Garcia or someplace in the area that will allow us greater access in the future to use those assets.
But ultimately, as we have been saying throughout, General, this is a war that will have to be won on the ground in a variety of ways.
Tom, I think I have been struck over the past 26 days with the differences in the way the President has prepared the nation for this operation as opposed to how we were prepared in 1999. You'll perhaps remember that the President of the United States took the ground option off the table before the first bomb was dropped in Kosovo, allowing Mr. Milosevic to focus his defenses and to understand exactly what the threat to him was. I contrast that with the President and his team, who has said that all options are on the table. Secondly, I'm struck by the way we have formed our coalition. Again, you'll remember in 1999 that we were limited by our allies to what targets we could strike. In fact, target sets were taken off the table. We were not allowed to strike them. I quote Mr. Rumsfeld, who said earlier last week, I believe, that in this particular operation, we will allow the mission to define the coalition as opposed to the coalition defining the mission. And finally, again, you'll remember that General Wes Clark and I, my boss, the SAC Europe, were essentially told before the operation started over Kosovo that we could not lose aircraft and we could not lose air crews because there was no tolerance within the American public for casualties. In this case, the President of the United States and his team have gone publicly and said to the American people, this will not be a video game. This is indeed a fight for national survival, and there will be casualties. Americans will lose their lives, and because this is a fight for national survival, the American military understands that. More importantly, Tom, the American people understand that, and we are committed.
Thank you very much. Retired Air Force General Michael Short, who's with us, will just give you a small peek now at some of those B-2 bombers that were taking off earlier today. They made the long flight over to the subcontinent and flew over Pakistani airspace, we believe. B-1 and B-2s and B-52s were all in the air today as part of the launch of 50 cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, from the air and also from sea, from submarines that included part of the British fleet. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklaszewski now at the Pentagon, who's just emerged from the briefing that was conducted by Secretary Rumsfeld and by General Richard Meyer, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Tom, there were three specific points that I took from the news conference with Secretary Rumsfeld. One, his emphasis that this first phase is not over. Indeed, we've been told that these airstrikes could continue for perhaps 3 or 4 days. The fact that, according to Secretary Rumsfeld, no aircraft were hit or damaged, no Americans were hurt, and that he did not rule out the possibility that U.S. ground troops would at some point in the near future end up there in Afghanistan in some kind of hunt for the terrorist elements of al-Qaeda network and perhaps bin Laden himself, although Rumsfeld said this is not about only one man, bin Laden, but it's about the entire terrorist organization. He did indicate very strongly that the U.S. Would provide some kind of support, perhaps military support for the opposition groups there. The objective here is that the Taliban military not only be bombed into submission, but essentially be bombed into collapsing within its own self to permit those opposition groups to take over from the Taliban and provide a more hospitable environment for U.S. troops to operate. At the same time, in response to the tape-recorded or videotaped address from Osama bin Laden, there's already some concern within high levels of the Bush administration. U.S. officials point out that in previous terrorist attacks, whether it was the attack on the 1998 attacks on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the attack on the USS Cole, the attack against the World Trade Center, all of those attacks were preceded by a taped or videotaped message from Osama bin Laden, just echoing the warning from Attorney General Ashcroft recently that terrorist attacks against American targets may not be over. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, NBC Jim Miklaszewski. Obviously, this is not just another Sunday in early October. It's a sparkling and beautiful day on the Atlantic seaboard, but there are lots of anxieties, indeed deep fears among some people that something else may happen in this country. So far, the FBI says nothing untoward has happened. Los Angeles had a small tremor, but security has been beefed up, and combat air patrols, CAPs, are being flown over football games across the country today. Let's begin first in New York's Times Square, which is about 3 miles from the World Trade Center, where the work is still underway. The now recovery work and rescue work, the rescue work is pretty well finished as they continue to haul the debris out of there. Here's NBC's Ann Thompson. What's it like in Times Square, Ann?
Tom, you know, this is the first Sunday since September 11th that New York City seems truly back to normal. The streets are crowded with traffic, the sidewalks filled with New Yorkers and tourists who've come down here to Times Square. The tickets line where you can get discount seats to Broadway shows. There were hundreds of people in that line today. For 2 hours they stood waiting to see this afternoon's performances. It has been an amazingly normal Sunday afternoon, despite the news that the U.S. has started bombing Afghanistan. We've talked to many people as they've come by here. They have expressed broad support for the airstrikes, but there are also grave concerns about the consequences of retaliation for both the people of Afghanistan and the people of the United States. We've asked people about how they feel in New York City today in light of the fact that the U.S. has started bombing Afghanistan. They sit by, for the most part, people have said they feel safe. At one hotel, they have seen evidence of heightened security, but I can tell you down here at Times Square, we've seen no evidence of heightened security. Things have gone on as normal. We've watched people shoot a rat video today. The street vendors are out. It's, by all appearances, it's just another Sunday afternoon in New York and the first normal one in at least a month. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Ann Thompson. We should tell you as well that one of the Taliban spokesmen is now claiming that they did shoot down a plane in southern Afghanistan. There has been no confirmation of that. We have asked NBC's Jim Miklaszewski to look into it. You heard the Defense Secretary just moments ago say, in fact, no planes had been shot down. It would not be unusual for them to make such a claim at this hour as they attempt to mobilize their own constituency and expand it as well. Let's go to Los Angeles now on NBC's George Lewis. George?
Well, about 2 hours ago, Tom, we had our nerves rattled a little bit by a 2.9 magnitude earthquake. Now, normally, small earthquakes of that magnitude would barely pass mention because they're quite common in this seismically active area, but it occurred about a half hour after President Bush addressed the nation. A lot of people called the police, were wondering whether this was an explosion or an earthquake, so things have calmed down a little bit since then, but the Los Angeles police have gone on a tactical alert just in case there are any kinds of reprisals in the works. The Emergency Operations Center at the city that's below ground has been activated again just in case as a precautionary measure. All the airports are operating normally today, and the Port of Los Angeles is also operating normally, but the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences has just announced the cancellation of tonight's Emmy Awards, which were going to be held here at the Shrine Auditorium and in New York. A lot of nervous celebrities were wondering whether they should show up for those awards, and perhaps the broadcast of those awards will now be preempted by war coverage. So no Emmy Awards tonight. Otherwise, people seem to be going about their lives as normal. But as I say, Tom, a little bit shook up a couple of hours ago because of that small earthquake. Back to you.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's George Lewis. News from the world of entertainment. The Emmys, in fact, have been canceled. They were to be split between Los Angeles and New York, but now they've decided to cancel them all together, and we will have continuing coverage, of course, of these important developments in a far part of the world and in this country as well throughout the day on this NBC station, to say nothing of MSNBC. A couple of things to bring you up to date on now. We're told from the White House by NBC's David Gregory that President Bush called the congressional leaders last night from Camp David to tell them that the attacks would occur today. Also, Vice President Cheney and President Bush now have been separated once again. The Vice President taken to a secure location. That is a precautionary move on the part of the White House. Should there be some kind of an incident that is directed at either one of them, that the head of the government would remain intact in this country. Also, the President has called, Secretary of State Powell, rather, has called the Israeli Prime Minister Sharon regarding the timing of the U.S. attack, and the necessary coordinations were made. You heard earlier that Osama bin Laden invoked at great length and with great provocation the relationship between the United States and Israel as one of the justifications for the attack on the World Trade Center, saying all Americans would not live in peace as long as the Israelis remain in what he called Palestinian territories. Pakistan has regretted that diplomatic efforts to convince the Taliban leadership to respond to the international coalition did not succeed. Now military action has started against the Taliban regime. This from the Pakistani government. The Foreign Office spokesman in a statement issued Sunday evening said that Pakistan did whatever it could to convince the Taliban leadership of the gravity of the situation and take the right decisions in the interest of the Afghan people. Obviously, they failed to do that, and therefore those military actions were taken and are continuing at this hour in a variety of ways, so far as we know. But at the same time, the United States has also launched emergency airlifts of food and medicine and other supplies to the people of Afghanistan who were in terrible straits well before the attack on the World Trade Center. The Taliban government does not represent by any means all the people of Afghanistan. It is the governing coalition. It took power, obviously, after the Soviets were driven from the country. There was a power vacuum and a great contest between the Taliban and the people who now represent the Northern Alliance. It's always been a very complex, very tribal arrangement there, more 18th century than 21st century in so many ways. Let's go to NBC's Ron Allen now in Islamabad. Ron?
Tom, we're hearing more reports, more information from Taliban sources here and across the border in Afghanistan. We're hearing that what was apparently hit, at least what they're saying was hit, and of course none of this can be confirmed and some of this is their propaganda. They're saying that the Kandahar airport was hit, but the runways were not touched. They're also saying that there seemed to be a lot of damage in a residential neighborhood near Kandahar that is a known area where Osama bin Laden once lived or used to live and spent some time. There's also that unconfirmed report that we're hearing from the Taliban suggesting that they shot down an aircraft, and of course U.S. officials there are saying that that does not sound credible at all, that they have no reports of any planes being down. What we're beginning to hear is a lot of propaganda, a lot of defiant statements from the Taliban officials throughout this country trying to rally support, trying to say, in fact, that they are not going to surrender. We heard them earlier say that Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, the spiritual leader of the Taliban, are alive and well and have lived through the attack. We're also aware that the Pakistani government had a very lengthy cabinet meeting tonight. It wasn't described as an emergency session, but clearly the Pakistani government is now in a very tight spot, trying to maintain its support for the United States, yet try and quell any dissent here. Their statement that they released that you were alluding to earlier was significant because they kept saying in that statement that they hope that the attacks will end soon. They don't seem to be on board for a very lengthy campaign. They were also saying that they hope that what happens is not directed at the Afghan people and is done within UN Security Council resolutions. A couple of things that the Pakistani officials have been saying consistently as they have tried to keep support in this country for joining the U.S. coalition. And they have also said that they regret that diplomacy did not solve this problem. Again, throughout Pakistan, we're also hearing that there has been a significant statement released by the religious parties here, saying that, again, calling on their followers to begin a jihad or a holy war in response to what has happened. A very troubling statement because the religious parties here in this country carry some weight. There is some concern that they could get a lot of people out into the streets and perhaps cause some trouble here in the morning. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. NBC's Ron Allen, who is, as I say, in Islamabad today, where there is this continuing delicate situation for the Pakistanis. They've aligned themselves very completely with the coalition that has been put together by President Bush and Secretary of State Powell. But at the same time, there are great fears that there could be internally an Islamic eruption in that Islamic State. Earlier tonight, after the initial U.S. military strikes against positions around Kandahar and Kabul, we're told there was a small demonstration in the city of Peshawar, which is right up on the Afghan border. It's always been a hotbed of activity, and about 100 students went out into the streets and protested the U.S. military action, but it was not an overwhelming show. There were an equal number of police, and after a few minutes, apparently, the protest simply faded away. So that's the situation at this hour. That we think that the strikes are continuing now, and there are emergency food and medical drops being made at the same time. President Bush addressed the nation today at about 1 o'clock Eastern Time. He has been officially separated from Vice President Cheney, who has been taken to another secure location. We've heard from Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Meyer. We're told as well that Secretary Powell has been working from his home in Arlington, Virginia, calling leaders around the world, explaining why we took the military action and the extent of it. British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who's been an active member of this coalition and assisting President Bush, whom he called a statesman today, went on television in his home country to praise the role of the British forces and to say once again, this is a war that affects all people all over the world. We heard, too, from Osama bin Laden on Al Jazeera television, which comes out of Qatar, which is the kind of official voice. of the Middle East. There he is, and he said that thanks be to God, the United States was struck in the softest parts, and there are fears now east to west and north to south across the United States. He ended up with a warning that there will be no peace for anyone in this country as long as the Israelis continue to occupy those parts of what he called the Palestinian territories. He also raised the war during the Gulf, during Operation Desert Storm, referring not just to the presence of American troops in his home country of Saudi Arabia, which is the keeper of the two most holy sites, of course, in the Islamic faith, but he then talked about the deaths of what he described of 1 million Iraqi soldiers, and no one, he said, condemned that in the Islamic world, suggesting that it fell to him to do that, to take on the United States, without bothering to point out that the United States was in Saudi Arabia to protect that country from being overrun by Saddam Hussein. NBC's Andrea Mitchell, are you there?